We're at a good spot. You don't need a lot of review for where we were at. But when we were last together, I asked, does it matter that Jesus wasn't a Levite? And to us, as Gentiles, it matters way less than it did to the Jews that this Hebrews writer was writing to. That's where we left it off. And at the end of chapter 7, he was talking about Jesus fulfilling the role of high priest in the order of Melchizedek and how he was perfected and perfect in that role, in a perfected role of high priest after the order of Melchizedek. For it is indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, and in Psalm 110, which is what he's referring to here, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. We're going to come back to this word perfect again, but remember the word perfect there. What that Greek word is talking about is finishing something completely, completing it to a successful end, not perfection in the way we normally think of perfection. So, what I want to do before we jump into chapter 8 is just remind you of something because this becomes important in what we're going to talk about next. The Hebrews theme. And this is the theme that we have seen over and over again, which I haven't really referred to a lot because it is the theme that generally when people teach Hebrews that they belabor, that they go on about all of, because this is the theological, the Christian perspective, the theme that tends to pop out. And that is the theme of what we're calling here perfection. The Greek word, several different Greek words of the same kind from the same roots, but teleiosis, the kind of perfection that is finishing something successfully, completely. And the way that we translate that, the way that we talk about that, when we talk about the theme of the book generally, is this notion of better, which is the Greek word that he uses over and over again. We see this word dozen or more times in this book, kreittōn. This Greek word kreittōn simply means better. And what he's talking about up to this point, we've seen over and over again, and he will continue to say, what was in the past, we now have something better than, referring to whichever thing it particularly is. But remember, the whole first couple of chapters is about how Jesus is better than things. And then we proceeded on to talk about the other things. So the better things. Jesus is one of those things. Remember the very first thing he talked about. The angels have always been seated around God's throne. But now Jesus is seated at the right hand of God around the throne. Jesus' position is better than the position of the angels. And he talked about all the ways that Jesus was better fulfilling those roles. The promise, we talked about the promise several times. And Abraham's and Israel's promise from God, the promise we now have ourselves as Christians from God, is better. We have a better promise than they had. We just talked about the priesthood of Melchizedek being better than the priesthood of the law. So we have this theme. And even when he was talking about at the end of chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 6, the people he's writing to are better than they were or would be if they went back to what they were. He uses that very term, teleiosis, when he talks about them. He says, we think of better things of you. The question that we're approaching here, what is this better? Is it a change from something to what is better? Again, that Greek word kreittōn, which is the word he uses over and over again, or is it a revelation of what has always been? When he's talking about these things, he's talking about them changing to something better. The Old Testament becomes the New Testament. The question number two, is it a revelation, was the New Testament what God wanted in the Old Testament all along? And so he's just now revealing what he's always wanted, instead of changing from what he wanted in the Old Testament to what he wants now. And so again, this word kreittōn is what the writer of the book of Hebrews continues to use. These two words basically are the same point. We talked about this word metathesis last week. That's the word change in English. And it doesn't mean to swap out something, to take this away and put something in its place. It means to take this and make it into this. There's that nuance of difference in this Greek word. So is it a metathesis or is it apokalypsis? Apocalypse. It is the book of Revelation has the name apocalypse, which is the word to reveal. That's why we call it in English revelation. So is this a change of this to this, or is it a revealing of what it really always was? That's the question. Doesn't make a lot of sense to you now, but when we get through what we're about to talk about, you'll understand why I'm presenting it this way. So this is how chapter 8 begins. Now the point in what we are saying, all that stuff I've already talked about, and specifically, very specifically, this order of Melchizedek priesthood, the point in that we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. And this again, what he's talking about here with Jesus sitting at the right hand, comes from Psalm 110, which is the same place that the introduction of what he considers a prophecy of a priesthood after the order of Melchizedek that is forever. So this is still tied up into Psalm 110 when he says we have a high priest seated at the right hand. That's where all this is coming from. What we're going to be talking about is introduced first in verse 2 with this reference to a true tent. What is the true tent that he's talking about? What tent is he talking about? The tabernacle tent that Moses built after he went up on Mount Sinai and received instructions about it. So it is representative of the law, but he's going to be talking about it. He's going to be talking about that idea as an example. The true tent. Jesus did not make his sacrifice after the order of Melchizedek in the tent or the temple that man set up. He did it in a different temple, is the argument here, is what he's saying. So let's read the next 3 verses, because this idea continues. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. That's what high priests do. They offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for the priest to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are no priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, the tabernacle, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." And that's Exodus 25:40. Specifically, God was referring here to what we call the menorah, the candlestick. But here, the writer of the book of Hebrews is applying this to everything. The idea being, when Moses went up on Sinai, God showed him a model, a pattern. This is what you need to build. And he took that model down and recreated it to the best of his ability. Just to kind of get you to have a feel for what this copy and shadow of heavenly things is that we need to be thinking about. Moses made a tent and put the things in it that he saw, as I said, as he could best replicate. Did God show him what he actually created, what Moses actually was able to make, or did God show him something that was a lot better, but Moses just didn't have the ability to do that? You follow me there? And that kind of gets to the root of this question that we're asking here. But God showed him something that he was to use as a model, and it's, according to the writer of this book, it served as a copy and a shadow of heavenly things. This word copy is a little misleading because when we think of the word, we think of it as something that's not the same, but looks the same. It is a copy in the sense that it is basically a reflection. This word's a little bit different in Greek. It really tends to mean something more tangible than a copy. It's not a copy, it is the thing itself. This does convey the idea that we're having to address here. They are a copy and shadow of things that are heavenly. So here's ultimately what I'm asking you to approach. Are these heavenly things in heaven, and have they always been sitting there in heaven? Has there always been a temple in heaven, and God just showed Moses that temple and all the things in it? Or is there something else going on here? Now, just as a reminder, this is what we're talking about with this tabernacle, this tent. This was the result of what Moses did. So he created the outer court, again, with something portable, because they're moving around. You can't build a structure and move a structure around. So he makes something portable. He can move around. The altar's outside, and there's a laver, which is a wash bowl, a giant bowl to wash sacrifices in. And then on the inside of the tent, you have the outside the Holy of Holies, you have the candlestick, the table of showbread, and the incense altar. And then you have the curtain. And then behind the curtain is the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. So this is what came of what Moses saw on the mountain. This reference here in Hebrews to this heavenly temple that Jesus made his sacrifice in, this is not the only place we have that reference in the Bible. It's also in the book of Revelation. This is the most specific. Now, it is insinuated in other places besides even this. But here, this is the most specific reference we have outside of Hebrews. In Revelation 11, John says, then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of his covenant, was seen within the temple, within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and earthquake and heavy hail. We come back to chapter 15, and he there refers to the temple again. After this I looked in the sanctuary of the tent of witness. So he calls it there what the writer of Hebrews is calling it, the tent in heaven. The tent of witness in heaven was opened. So John, during the book of Revelation, refers to it both as temple and tent. But he talks about it's in heaven, and he sees it in heaven. And it's doing things in heaven. So this is not just a unique idea to the writer of the book of Hebrews. It was probably the idea that everybody at this time had about what God had in heaven. Generally, to the children of Israel throughout their history up until the New Testament, what purpose did the tabernacle and the temple really serve besides the whole sacrifice thing? It was called God's house. And they meant that literally. This is where God lives, in this house. Because you'll remember when they did the various things with the tabernacle, they had this pillar of cloud and pillar of fire, and it would come to the temple. It would come to the tabernacle. So that this idea is that this is where God lives. So if God is in heaven, he has to have a place in heaven. So that's kind of the circle that we're working within here. Did God show Moses a perfect vision of what he should build? Or did God show Moses the perfect version that he should copy? By what the writer of the book of Hebrews is doing, this is a distinction that we have to come to. And do you see what I'm saying there? Do you see what the distinction is? Did God show Moses a vision of what he should make? Basically, did God show Moses blueprints, a picture of what he should make? Or did he open heaven and show him what was already in heaven, already built and sitting there? Those are two different things. And there's no clarity in the scripture about which it is. The words that are used to describe what takes place doesn't tell us that. So that's the question that we're asking here. And there's a reason that I'm drawing this line, because this point in the book of Hebrews is a point of interpretation that this becomes very important for. Ultimately, this is the real question. Which version of Christianity did God intend for us to have? If we have now achieved the perfect, the completed thing that God wanted us to have, was it the Jewish version or the Greek version? And I've talked about this before in the past. And one way for you to think about this that kind of gets it down to its most practical level is to answer this question. What happens when you die? If you die now, what do you think is going to happen? So your body and spirit will separate. Right. And your spirit goes to heaven. Right. A completely Greek concept. It's not what Jews thought. It's not what the writer of the book of Hebrews thought. Because they still believed that you really couldn't separate those things. That the body, you had to have a body. And you can see that in the New Testament itself. If the most important part of us, the part of us that could be with God, was our spirit, why does the body get resurrected? Why do we need a body? And yet it's very clear from the New Testament, when God comes back, what happens? The body we used to have, it gets changed, but it comes out. It comes back. We have to have a body. That's the way the Jews thought. That's why it's like it is. So we have taken that out of this, because we think that the spirit is the true self, and the spirit goes to God when we die, and that whole body thing is, we'll deal with that later, but it's not all that important. And the Jews were not like that at all. So that's why this kind of gets you thinking in the difference. Because the Greeks, the Greek philosophical discussions of the few centuries before this made that distinction that the body, and you see some of this in Gnosticism, the body is the illusion. The spirit is the truth. And the Greeks didn't, the Jews didn't think of it in those terms. They thought reality was real. That what we're doing right now is real, and that there isn't this whole separation of the spiritual stuff from the physical stuff that the Greeks did. You may remember this, Plato's cave allegory. All of these ideas that we're talking about being Greek come from Plato, or Plato's time. He wasn't the only one that taught these kinds of things, but he's the most famous. He's the one we have the most information about. His ideas are the ones that endured, and this cave allegory is how he explained this idea in Greek, in the Greek approach, that we're all sitting on this side of a wall, and the servants of God, for us it would be angels, are carrying these little forms in front of a fire, a big light, which cast shadows on the cave wall for us to see. So everything that we see in what we call our reality is really just a shadow. And the goal of human beings is to realize that and get free from your bonds and walk around the wall and escape into the true reality, which is beyond the fire. So you follow that, what he's talking about here? That's the cave allegory. And whether you really realize it or not, the kind of Christianity that we've ended up with is a lot like that. Because we think that all of this is the bad side, the bad stuff, and eventually we're going to escape it, and then we'll be able to see what's really going on. And that's the whole concept. Now, me asking this question is not an original thing. The process I've repeated over and over again, this was all hammered out in the first 3 centuries of the church. The church fathers did exactly this same exercise that I'm talking about here. So, right after the New Testament was written, in the early 2nd century, Justin Martyr comes along, and he talks about this in his writings. For example, whatever things were rightly said among all men are the property of us Christians. He's referring there to the Greek philosophy. His point is, all the things the Greek philosophers stumbled on that were true, that were right, really belong to Christians. So it was a way of God warming us up, in essence. He said, those who lived reasonably are Christians, such as Socrates, who is the true author of Plato. Plato was just writing down what Socrates said according to Plato. Socrates and Heraclitus. So the idea from Justin Martyr is there are things in Greek philosophy that didn't make it over into the Old Testament that are right. And now that we're in the New Testament, those principles need to be applied. Clement of Alexandria followed behind him, and these are just the ones that we have writings from that we're aware of. But he followed on him and said things like philosophy was given to the Greeks as a covenant. In other words, the same idea that we get from the Old Testament, where the children of Israel were given this covenant by God, the Greek philosophy was the covenant to the Greeks from God, implying that they were being worked on, and what came out of that was for our benefit. Origen really liked Greek philosophy. One of a multitude of things that he said, And part of the reason he was never included in the church fathers list was things like this. The philosophers of Greece have made many correct statements since God revealed it to them. So God not working through Israel, but working through the Greek philosophers, brought in ideas that we have to incorporate into Christianity. So there's 3 examples. Tertullian comes along and says, y'all are crazy. Are you Christians or Greek philosophers? So his most famous statement about this is, there you see the Latin, quid ergo Athenas et Hierosolamus. It's Jerusalem. What indeed has Athens, Greek philosophy, to do with Jerusalem? Because if you look at the Bible, including the New Testament, where are we encouraged to follow after anything that the Gentiles put forth? In fact, we see exactly the opposite. Doesn't talk about Greek philosophy. It says, here's the example. Everything that's happened in the Old Testament is the example. The law from God in the Old Testament is the example. The writer of the book of Hebrews, that's what he talks about completely. He never brings in the ideas of the pagans. He's only using the basis of the Old Testament. And that's what Tertullian was saying. What's wrong with you people? So then we get a little further down the road. Now Christianity's legal. Now it's supported by the government. And Augustine does what generally happens with doctrine. He said, oh, you're both right. Here's some examples of how he approached it. He started out, before he was saved, in Greek philosophy. He studied Greek philosophy. So he says, as an example, I read in the books of the Platonists that in the beginning was the Word. So he's saying, I read in the books of the Greeks that the word, the logos, that term, they use it the way we use it. In the beginning was the logos. The logos has always been. So he says, I read in the book of the Platonists that in the beginning was the Word, but that the Word was made flesh, I did not read there. So he's saying that you're both right. Yes, I read in the Greek works that the Word has always existed. But then I have to understand from the Jewish perspective that the fact that the Word was God, the Word was Jesus, and that it was made flesh and dwelt among us, I can only get that from the Jewish side. So we just have to put them together. Another example, he quotes 2 Corinthians 4:18 to argue that there is a non-material reality. In other words, what we were just talking about a minute ago. We live in a physical reality, but the true reality is the non-physical reality. That's the argument that he makes out of 2 Corinthians 4. Well, here's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4. For God has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the knowledge of the glory of God. But we have this treasure, this understanding of God and his face through Jesus Christ. We have that treasure in jars of clay, referring to our bodies. So we have the truth of God in our bodies because of our salvation, because of our understanding of Jesus through Jesus, to show us that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. And then at the end of that chapter, so we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, they pass away, but the things that are unseen are eternal. This, from the approach that Augustine is taking, this supports the idea that we're all supposed to follow the Greek philosophical understanding of the cosmos now. And the Jewish understanding was always wrong, even though it's what he gave the Jews in the Old Testament. That's where we're at in the book of Hebrews. That's the decision point that next week I'll kind of step you through, because just from the reading in Hebrews, just from the words he uses in Hebrews, that's not his approach at all. This whole spiritual realm thing was not the way he was thinking at all. Because why? He's working from a Jewish perspective. I mean, he's using the Old Testament all the time. He never refers to the Greek philosophers as being right. What God established in the Old Testament has been metathesis. It's not been removed and replaced. It's been shifted. So he doesn't see it because, and just to get you to that level ground, what has he talked about every time? He's talked about how the promise to Abraham is now our promise. The order of Melchizedek is now the correct priesthood. He doesn't say the priesthood goes away. The priesthood is something you need. It was established in the Old Testament. We need a priesthood. We just have a better one now. So he's working completely in that framework. He's not saying you have to change the way you think about everything. So that's where we're going from here. We'll pick it up there next week.